I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. In hosting this program, admittedly, I'm exposed to a ton of insights on careers and what they're all about. And oftentimes, after speaking with a guest, I come away with a radically new understanding about what it is they do. Well, this was definitely the case for today's episode. Heading into this conversation covering the life of a paramedic, I thought I had it more or less already worked out and understood. Just general understanding. In fact, early on, the guest shared that he considers himself as representing the toolbox of the healthcare system. He's the Swiss Army knife and the duct tape. My initial reaction? Yeah, I could kind of envision this. Makes sense. However, a funny thing happened along the way. As I began to share more and more about the work, I soon realized that I really knew very little about what it truly means to be a paramedic. And by the end, I actually found myself returning to this metaphor of him being representative of this Swiss Army knife and duct tape of the healthcare system. However, the reasons for this were utterly different than what I initially thought. All of this to say, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So I do encourage you to stick around, listen in on this episode, challenge your assumptions, especially if this is a career of interest to you. And I promise you'll be picking up a ton of new insights. Anyway, I do think it is about time to get started, so let me more formally introduce today's guest to you, and we can launch into this. Jonathan Lee is a critical care paramedic who is a member of the Special Operations Team at Ornge in Toronto, Canada. His clinical experiences include 911, critical care, aeromedical, and pediatric critical care transport. In addition to his clinical practice, he's also an experienced educator with teaching experience involving a number of healthcare professions, as well as his current role in the paramedic program at Georgian College. And through Jonathan's consulting company, he's developed and delivered KinderMedic, a program designed to improve confidence and competence in the emergency care of children. This is in line with his research interests, which are focused on the pre-hospital care of children, a topic which he has been invited to speak on internationally, including across North America, Europe, and Asia. His ongoing column, Frontline Farm, can be found at ems1.com. His previous professional activities included serving on the Emergency Pediatric Care Committee of the National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians, as well as the Board of Directors of the Ontario Paramedic Association. Jonathan is currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Critical Care from Cardiff University. One last thing, you will notice that the audio quality is a little bit off. It isn't as crystal clear as what it normally is. For that, we do apologize. If this is your first time listening, please know that this is not the norm. However, we did decide to go through with the episode just based off of the great content that Jonathan does share. So with all of this noted, I'd like to welcome you to my conversation with Jonathan Lee. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Jonathan?
Absolutely amazing. Thank you for having me, sir. Christopher, Chris?
Yeah, whichever's fine. But really excited for this conversation. In diving into your background, certainly quite impressive, and I'm sure a wealth of experiences as well along the way that I'm really keen to share with listeners here. I do have this first segment lined up, something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just read off of a definition, something related to what the guest is all about. Surprise, surprise, I do have you down here for paramedic. So let me just read this off, and then perhaps afterwards you could comment. Does it sound okay?
Sure.
All right, so here we go. Paramedic. A paramedic is a healthcare professional trained in the medical model, whose main role has historically been to respond to emergency calls for medical help outside of a hospital. Paramedics work as part of the emergency medical services, EMS, most often in ambulances. They also have roles in emergency medicine, primary care, transfer medicine, and remote offshore medicine. The scope of practice of a paramedic varies between countries, but generally includes autonomous decision making around the emergency care of patients. There we go. A fairly practical look, I would say, at your work, but based off your experiences, based off the wealth of knowledge that you have and you've accrued across your career. What would you say to that?
I'd say that's pretty accurate, a little more formal than I would describe it if you wanted a bit of color and you were asking me what I do. I'm sort of the toolbox of the healthcare system. I am the Swiss Army knife and the duct tape.
I like that. Yeah.
So I am a little bit of nurse, a little bit of doctor, a little bit of respiratory therapist, a little bit of firefighter, a little bit of social worker. I'm a little bit of everything. I tend to be the sort of first point of contact for a lot of people. And I also as a paramedic, you also tend to end up being like the default point of contact. So I don't know what else to do. So a lot of times it's just I'm calling ambulance.
Yeah.
So that would be sort of how I.
Add some color to it all. Yeah, no, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the beauty of this segment is hearing those particular insights. Is there anything that you would really emphasize as part of your role that wasn't necessarily covered in that definition? Is there something, or even de-emphasize for that matter?
I think, regardless of my environment that I work in, I just think that if you ask me what I do, I am unashamedly a patient care advocate. So I think that as you enter the profession, there is certainly a bit of a gap between what you think is going to happen and what is actually going to happen. And I realize that the medicine part happens probably less frequently than people think, but the social part and the psychological part, it happens every time, right? So you called me for a reason, called me because you needed help. And sometimes that help is medicine and sometimes it isn't. So I think that's what I see my role as to get you what you need. Sometimes that's medicine and sometimes that's not.
That's an interesting insight. Yeah, and I'm sure that's something that we're going to get into a little bit later on in this conversation. But before we do, maybe we could learn a little bit more about what you're currently involved in. I mean, certainly off the top, I did introduce you to listeners and listed off a few things very lightly. But maybe you could share a little bit more about your current role.
I'm in Ontario, Canada, and I work for Ornge, which is a provincially run healthcare provincial here. So the province funds a helicopter and or air ambulance and critical care transport service for the province, which is responsible for scene response. It is responsible for transporting patients distance and just basically making sure that the constitutional guarantee of equal access to healthcare gets to people who live in a province that is probably the size of what was the conversation we were just having? It is larger than France and Spain combined, the geographic size. So, and then the vast majority of the population of Ontario, Canada lives within 100 kilometers of the border of the United States. So anybody who lives north of that 100 kilometers of the border, it's my job to make sure they get good access to healthcare.
Yeah. Okay.
At the moment, I am part of the special operations team at Ornge. So I spend about half of my time working a regular clinical shift, which is to say on one of a couple of assets that we have. It might be a land ambulance, it might be a helicopter, it might be a fixed wing aircraft. And then the rest of the time I spend doing sort of special projects, stuff that's sort of outside and above the normal purview of the organization.
To add further clarity to all of this, perhaps we could step into this other segment, a day in the life. What does that look like for you? I think this is something that's always quite interesting for listeners is to get that inside sort of scoop on, what a typical day or maybe a week looks like.
Well, that's the trick, right? I'm fortunate because I've found a spot that really I don't do well with structure and repetition and sameness. It's not my thing. I found something that would allow me to exercise that need to be doing something different is why I survived so long in this environment, I think. My time, at least half of my time is spent clinically. So I guess that's probably a good way to start. The shift that I work on typically is out of Toronto and in a land ambulance. So showing up to work a 12-hour shift, days and nights, is the part that's going to have to change as soon as I get older, to be honest with you. The schedule is to be in a land ambulance. I have a regular partner who I work with. And between the two of us, we staff an ambulance and we move patients around. So what that looks like is we usually take turns. The role functions very well as a team, but somebody usually has to be ultimately making decisions. And my partner and I are equals. So it's not about, one person being in charge. It just means that ultimately somebody has to be the decision maker. So typically we take turns. So I will be the one responsible for, we call it attending and running the call, basically doing the thinking and the decision making and the talking. And then the other person does the skills. So I'm going to get the drugs ready. I'm going to get the monitor. I'm going to do that kind of stuff. And then in my role in an ambulance, the person doing the skills usually just hops in the front and drives, and I'll stay in the back with the patient. That is sort of similar, but not quite the same when it comes to if we happen to be moved to an airplane or a helicopter, in that if we're in a helicopter or an airplane, somebody's driving for us. So I am fortunate enough to have my partner in the back, so there can be two of us taking care of the patient in the back. The day, what is amazing about my job at Ornge is we have 13 bases, probably 30 different assets across the province. And the type of medicine and the type of patients is so incredibly variable depending on where you are. There is really no normal day. Most of my days down in the city, because I'm in Toronto, a big population, a lot of big hospitals, we move a lot of patients who have very acute medical needs. So if you are on a ventilator, or you have a lot of infusions, or you need medication to maintain your blood pressure, most normal 911 paramedics are sort of trained and equipped to sort of stabilize people for that, 15, 30, 60 minutes it takes to get to the hospital. Our reach is much longer. We do a lot of movements between hospitals. So if I were to take you from whatever hospital is closest to your house to the big university medical center down the road because you need some sort of higher level of care that can't be provided in the community, what they will do is call Ornge, and I can move you from one hospital to the other and take over all the care. So the small hospital doesn't lose a doctor or a nurse or a respiratory therapist to the transport. So that's the bulk of my transports are a result of it's just providing that higher level of care. We do a degree of transports within the system that are done especially by air, just for distance. So you're not necessarily in need of medicine acutely, but you are in a remote community that may be 5, 6, 7-hour ambulance drive from the hospital that you need. So while you don't need a lot of medical attention, nobody wants to spend 7 hours in the back of an ambulance. And then the new stuff is the helicopter also has a role where if patients are acutely and time sensitively ill, the local land ambulance service, the local EMS service can activate the aircraft and we will come down and see the stuff that you see on the news, right? There's a 5-car pileup on, the big highway. So we'll shut down the highway, land, stabilize the major trauma patients, and bring them into the trauma center. And certainly for us, that is very seasonal here. So, in the summer when everybody's driving around to the cottage and that kind of stuff, and they're doing their driving too fast and making bad decisions, that's when we do the volume of those kind of patients.
Okay. Well, I think that sheds, some light on all of this. And the thing that stuck out to me, again, from an outsider's perspective, my assumption at least was that primarily you'd be involved in these, medical emergency situations. But to hear this other side of the work, the transport side, quick question here, like what would be a ratio of that, say the emergency services versus the transport?
It so depends on where you are and what asset you are working on. So fully, at least Toronto as a metropolitan city of 3 or 4 million, even if you're not from Ontario, you can recognize that that's just 4 million. So there's just going to be a lot of things and a lot of sick people. So if I'm working in the helicopter in Toronto, I'm going to do, especially in the summer, better than 50% of what I do in the summer is going to be trauma. If you are in Canada in the winter, sometimes you don't really leave the house because it's cold. So the number of traumas sort of is certainly very seasonal. So we actually call it trauma season. It goes from our May long weekend here to the September long weekend where everybody is geared up to go out and enjoy the summer. So that is where we peak, where we do the most trauma is in that period. If you flip the seasons, as you go into the fall and into the winter, that's our respiratory season. So for, especially into December, January here, where we're into the dead of winter, we move a ton of kids with viral respiratory stuff, right? So that's, and we have a fairly limited capacity to do critical care pediatrics across the province. They're very centralized and very specialized into a number of centers. So during respiratory season, we a lot of those. It is so dependent on where you are, what asset you are on, and what the year is. In a land ambulance, I probably do very little scene response, less than 5%. Summertime, helicopter, greater than 50%.
That's interesting. Yeah, I just had a guest on recently who were speaking about the seasons of work, and I was in a completely different industry within sustainability, but the point sort of remains the same. It's something that I think for listeners, when they are considering work or different careers and whatnot, this aspect of the seasonality of it all, and something to consider as well. No, that's really, really interesting insights there.
It's funny, but I will tell you this: busiest day for highway accidents in North America. Do you know what day it is? Super Bowl Sunday.
Okay, well there you go. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's
big events.
Sometimes
right? Yeah. It makes complete sense when you break it down that way, in the way that you sort of laid it out. It makes complete sense, but it's just not something I ever would have, considered. Well, I would like to step into another segment here called Pathways, and here I just sort of explore, what brought professionals into the career that they ended up in, and I'd love to find out, what initially attracted you to becoming a paramedic.
So, tell a story. It sounds terrible, but I left high school fairly early with a path of going to university, going to medical school, that kind of stuff. That was ultimately my goal. And I was fairly young when I left high school. And it was in my decision making was, I don't know that I'm prepared to go to university at the moment. At the time, it was a fairly short program here to become a paramedic. It was only a year of college. So my thought was, I'm going to go and take this program. This will give me some medical exposure. This will give me, if I'm going to go to medical school, I'm staring down 10 years of education. This will give me a way to sort of help me pay for that education. This will give me a lot of opportunity. So that was ultimately what drew me into it. And then once I got into it, I was fairly comfortable in it. Right. I think that my view of what it meant to be a paramedic changed as I started doing it. And certainly as I went from 911 to flight. And then my view of what it meant to be a doctor also changed. So I got really comfortable doing this. And I think that was my fit was better here than it would have been, going through medical school, and that process turned fairly quickly. Actually, it wasn't like a big no, I got through it and I'm like, this is me. This is where I'm comfortable. It's not like, I regret it or anything like that. So I did stumble onto it a little by accident.
Okay. Was it something that, like, innately you were drawn towards as far as like just wanting to serve others, to help, to be of assistance? Was that something when you were, say, within your youth that you were attracted to, or is this something that sort of, evolved as you got closer to becoming an adult and trying to figure out what you wanted to do?
When I was a kid, I did a lot of volunteer stuff in that space, right? And so I think I've been fairly ingrained to that sort of, I want to help people. I taught, like even going through college, I remember teaching CPR and first aid courses going through college. So that the teaching and the helping came fairly natural. And then once I realized that degree of autonomy that I had, being able to work like and what it actually meant to be a doctor. And when I say doctor, I mean like an emerge doc who was ultimately what I kind of had in my head, right? And then you look at the emerge doc, and that emerge doc is one in the hospital all day, and they call him an emerge doc, but most of what he does is not emergency at all, right? So my view of what that role of a physician was changed, and the idea of being in the same place in the same hospital for 8 or 10 or 12 hours when I could have my own ambulance or be bombing around in a helicopter seemed a much better option to me.
Yeah, you already mentioned, at one point in our conversation about your attraction to the fact that the work that you're involved in isn't, anything but the mundane, right? There's a lot of variety within it. And it sounds like to me that you were considering and reflecting on a lot of these things, during that point, like what drives you, what do you want, what don't you want, perhaps. And I think that's a really valuable insight for, for people that are at that point when they're trying to evaluate careers. It almost helps just to have that list, those two sides of the table there. What are things that, are attractive? What are things that aren't so attractive to you, and projecting those types of ideas, onto different professions. It can be a very helpful exercise, I think, in trying to find out, where to go with things.
I think there's that. And the other component of it for me was, I don't know what kind of 17-year-old you were, but I'm happy to tell you that I'm kind of very different now than I was when I was 17. So the other thing that I think was really good for me during that process was when in high school and like, things are very abstract, right? I'm learning about sickness. I'm learning about illness. I'm learning about this. Oh, I was in my late teens when I went and started paramedic school, right? So paramedic school broke my bubble. My view of the world was, this is my house, this is my friends from school, and it was very, very limited, right? So it was so eye-opening going to paramedic school, seeing the spectrum of society from the richest to the poorest, and just that exposure and my own age and my own self-awareness and learning what fit me and my personality and my behavior were probably the two things that did it, I think. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's terrific insights there. I do actually have another segment here where we could step into a Q&A discovery. We can continue this back and forth. And I'm looking to get back into the profession itself here. Now, for somebody from the perspective of someone who's interested in becoming a paramedic, I'd love to know about what are some of the underlying challenges that you wouldn't necessarily consider, as a layman, somebody who's looking at it from the outside, but in your estimation are real and they are there. And now conversely, on the other side of it, what would be some of the rewards that you wouldn't necessarily consider, but again, are part of the job and part of, the experience?
I will start by saying that my answers are going to be fairly geographically bound. Like I said before, in Canada, our system is provincially regulated, the healthcare system. So in Canada, between one province to another, what it means to be a paramedic is very different. Across North America, it is very different. When you move into the American model of healthcare, dramatically different than it is in Canada. So despite the surface similarities, that impacts a great deal of things. And then when you move sort of across the pond and look at some of the more European models of healthcare and paramedicine. So I will give you that caveat that everybody is very different from place to place. So initially, I would say challenges, I think certainly in the environment here that I'm used to, it's not impossible, but you need to have reasonable grades to get into the program here. It's not guaranteed acceptance, and it is reasonably academically challenging, our process here, especially as you move forward. So you need to be able to, have a certain degree of fluency in science and math and certainly communication. That changes very dramatically depending on where you are in the world. Certainly, as you move into the States, it is much more variable in the States what it takes to become a paramedic. And then when you move to places like the UK and Australia, those sort of places, it's undergraduate degree to enter practice and a master's degree to advance. So there's a whole spectrum of educational requirements based on where you are working. And then as a sort of byproduct of that, the role that you can take is sort of reflective of a lot of the education and the value that the system places in paramedics. The value that in Ontario, especially in my role, I feel pretty fortunate because we have a very wide scope of practice and a ton of autonomy. So to get to this level, it is academically very challenging. And it is more than just straight, can you pass a test kind of academic? It is sort of the practical component of it and being able to perform under sometimes incredibly stressful situations and navigate high risk situations that may not have clear answers. That's not for everybody. So I think making sure that your personality is equipped to do this is probably the biggest challenge. It's really not for everybody. If you need direction, if you need structure, if you need black and white, probably not what you're looking for.
Conversely, on the other side?
So the rewarding part is, and I don't even know, to be honest with you, Chris, like, is this a paramedic thing? Is this a me thing? I just feel like I have had so many opportunities presented to me that I just never thought would ever happen. That is probably the most rewarding part of it right now.
For example?
I have, as a paramedic, wrote, developed, and delivered a postgraduate emergency nursing program. That is not something that is typically done by paramedics. So being able to take a background I had in teaching and the gift that was this incredible scope of practice and exposure to acuity that is fairly rare. It's if you look past the title and look at the skill sets, I end up with a pretty good skill set, right? And when I leverage the skill set past the title, I can use the things that I've learned here to do some pretty non-traditional paramedic things. So that opportunity was amazing. We had, of course, just like everybody, the COVID struck Ontario fairly significantly. So the province geographically has a really large Indigenous population that are spread out into communities that may or may not have road access. So these isolated communities became incredibly high-risk pockets for COVID. So Ornge, as an organization, was tasked with vaccinating a lot of these remote communities. So I was allowed to, one of the great opportunities I had, I teach in the college program as well. So I had the opportunity to bring a group of my paramedic students and fly north and go into fly-in reserves a week at a time, set up a vaccination program, and vaccinate these isolated First Nations communities. And public health is not something you associate with critical care paramedic, nor is me spending a week in one place with the same group of people. So the relationships that I got to form, in some of those remote communities, some of those First Nations communities were so incredible. I was so blessed to be able to learn from those First Nation communities. So that kind of, I didn't. How do you picture that, right? I have at home on my wall, and you want to talk about things that I'm incredibly proud of. I went back to the same communities over and over again to make sure that I made a point of going back to these communities that I kind of had some ownership on. And I have on my wall, I framed it, this big eagle feather, which was a gift, a parting gift from the community as we left after we were vaccinated that. And that thing's precious to me. So how do you predict that?
Exactly. To me, it's sort of like it comes back to impact. It sounds like impact on several different levels, in ways that you expected perhaps, but in a lot of ways that you just outlined that you never would have seen coming. But all the same, they still kind of deliver some degree of, impact to others and assistance. So yeah, I really like that insight there.
And using impact as opposed to like the medicine part is huge, right? Like the number of people that the actual medicine impacts is probably fairly minimal, but the number of times, I can, like, even if you talk about stuff like end of life stuff, right? Like, which, scares so many people, but like, I firmly believe, right? Like all death is sad, but if I can be there in that moment with you and somehow make this a little, and I'm not going to say easier to deal with, but at least help with not going through it alone, or helping you understand what's happening, or help you sort of navigate this process that is so foreign to so many people. That is not what I expected.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I've got this other question that kind of dovetails the one we were just speaking about right now. And, it's returning to you in terms of, I guess, or somebody like yourself, like the impact that the profession can have on you, in terms of some of the stresses and pressures. I mean, what you were just speaking of right there, not the easiest stuff to be involved in, I would think, at least again, from somebody from the outside looking in on it all. I mean, the real stress, the pressure, the high stakes nature of the work, especially during the emergency, services aspect of it. So how do you go about compartmentalizing, or how do you manage yourself in all of this? Does it get easier through the trainings, through the experience, or is this something that you're consciously focusing in on and, having to be aware of it and be like, okay, no, I'm in the professional role now. I have to manage myself. Like, how does that work? I think that'd be something that'd be interesting to listeners who are considering this line of work.
So I will 100% tell you that what I'm about to say is very individual experience, right? So this is such a unique experience to each person that please don't take this as being the norm when I tell you about my experiences. I consider myself incredibly fortunate. I have not had nearly the battles with some of the mental health and stress challenges and that kind of stuff that is ubiquitous in the system right now. I'll tell you for free, COVID, that wasn't my best years. But outside of that, we could talk for an hour just about this. I have very clear views on sort of stress and expectations and that kind of stuff. What I will tell you from a snippet perspective is the answer is always stress is very individual. So and I learned this a long time ago, dealing with friends and family and that kind of stuff, right? Where I could say something that was incredibly stressful to me and then sharing that with my friends and they go, oh, he died. Isn't that your job? So, or to be honest with you, those ones aren't usually the ones that are the stressful ones, right? It's the sad truth is like, and why I think it's so important to focus on the patient experience as opposed to the medicine. In any subset of patients, like if I move 20 patients, I will tell you arbitrarily 16 or 17 of them are not going to die. Like it's not that kind of sick. So regardless of what I do, they're not going to die. Out of those 20 patients, 2 of them are so sick that no matter what I do, they're still die. So there is one patient out of those 20 where my interventions, and I got lots. I'm not saying I don't have, like I got all the toys. But the reality of medicine is there's a very narrow subset of patients where I can make that TV drama life-saving intervention that makes the patient go from death to walking out of the hospital. It's not that black and white. So a couple of things happened that helped me a great deal with dealing with that stress. When you look objectively and say, hey, there's only one out of any 20 patients that I can make that big life-changing difference on, it really puts my role in perspective. I work in a team. I have a role. I don't have the role, right? Nobody in healthcare does, regardless of what they do. It only functions if the system and the team functions as a whole. That's how you get good outcomes. So once I realized that my heroic role saving the life doesn't really happen, right? It's not that one intervention. The flip side of that is I am not solely responsible for the outcome either, right? So it's the function of the team that makes the difference. So my own specific sitting at home going, oh, I wish I did that. I wish I did this. I wish I did that. I've been doing it long enough now, and I'm objective enough now that I can say, okay, not that I don't take it personally, not that I don't, and everybody makes mistakes, that's going to happen. But I feel strongly like as long as I'm not making the same mistake twice, I will learn from my mistake. So that sort of objectivity has been a game changer for sort of my general stress levels. And I am also fortunate because what happens all the time is they're like, oh, you worked on the helicopter. That's got to be the most stressful job ever. It's only the sickest patient. That was the least stressful of my paramedic jobs. When I was brand new and I was working as the one paramedic who worked with a volunteer first responder in an ambulance service in a town of 1,500, and I didn't have any experience. And I hadn't moved up the levels. I didn't have any skills. We were doing, one patient every other day. So there was no comfort, no experience. That was by far the most stressful part of my career because one, I didn't have the tools. Two, I didn't have the knowledge and experience. And three, we just didn't see enough patients. So everything was stressful. The helicopter, I had all the training, I had all the experience, I had great partners, I had all the tools, I have all the hospitals. That part's easy. They're sick, but it's not that stressful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, these are insights that for somebody who's not, involved in the profession already, I think they're really helpful. So it sounds like to me like contextual matters count. Experience, as you just sort of outlined as well, is something that definitely helps. And this general reframe on it all. And again, that ties into the experience, how you can sort of objectively look at it all and make sense of it all. Certainly help. Yeah. No, I definitely, I think it clarifies and it adds a different layer of understanding to it.
You ever do anything with martial arts?
No, not personally, no.
So I think it's really just like, it's like being a white belt, right? The hardest part about, becoming a black belt is being a white belt, right? Like you got to make it through that first bit where you don't know anything. Everybody's beating you up. And I think I view paramedicine the same way. And the first part's the hard part, right?
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that. I do have another segment here that I'd like to step into, a water cooler story segment relating to the work, relating to the profession. So I'm quite keen to hear what you have for us today.
It's funny when we're sort of going back and forth about this. I have all of the stories. You can find me on those reality TV shows where they follow the helicopter around. I've been on all the news channels. We have a channel here called the Speed Network, and which is nothing but racing. I've been on the Speed Network, like we landed on a racetrack and pulled a guy out of the car and that kind of stuff. So I have all those kind of stories. I've done all of those kind of things. I've been fortunate enough to travel the world and make some amazing people. But I think if you called me 15 years ago and asked me this, the story would be related to one of those circumstances. Like, oh, I did a call in a tank, or we hovered the helicopter over a ship and I jumped out to go get the guy. I got all those stories. I'm at the point in my career where I take the most satisfaction from being able to say, hey, when we talk about impact, I can make a very limited impact on my own. But as I spend more time training and mentoring, mostly paramedics, up through the process, that is my big sort of take home, being able to make that kind of influence on the system. And I know that you met Blair, and you had Blair on one of your previous podcasts. So if you want a reason why you should get into the profession, I mean, like, I couldn't think of a better example, right? There are a bunch of paramedics in the system, and Blair's one of them, that I have such ownership over because of, my role when they first came in. And, when you look back at what Blair did, and when I first met him 20 years ago, to have any sort of connection with that, that kind of stuff goes, right? So those are the things that when I can, say, get a phone call from my paramedic student from 15 years ago going, do you think I should go to Stanford and do a critical care fellowship? Right? Like that, when you talk about impact, that's my way of impact, right? So I am going to take my tiny little slice of joy for every patient that he impacted. Or, and I have a bunch of them in the system that I feel so much ownership over, that I've had the privilege of being able to train. So to me, each one of those paramedics that I've been involved in training, I get a little sense of joy every time I think about the impact they're having on the system.
Yeah, I love that.
That's the kind of water cooler story you were looking for.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's real and it's meaningful. I think a big part of fulfillment in anyone's career is if you're able to tap into that, if you can find that, and you can, understand that the type of impact that you are having. That's where you can derive that sense of satisfaction in the moment, but then also too when you reach that point in your career when you are hanging it up and you're looking back on it. If you have those types of reflections or those types of understandings of how you were able to contribute. Again, I think that's where some of the satisfaction lies. Yeah, it's nice to hear that you found it already while you're still very, active in the work that you're doing.
There is nothing better than somebody new coming in and I'm working with them, and I'm in the middle, and I'm trying to find a relatable analogy to this, but you're in the middle of a call, and that paramedic that I've never worked with does something, and I look over and I'm like, what is that? I'm like, why did you do that? Like, oh, my preceptor told me that I always do this way. I always do it this way. This is the best way to do it. This is the best way to do it. Oh, who was your preceptor? Oh, it was so-and-so. Oh, I taught him that. And then he taught you that. And now you're here doing it in front of me. And like that kind of stuff.
Mind blowing in a way, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That to me is impact. That's impact.
Yeah. And just to bring listeners up to speed as well, I mean, the person you were just referencing, Blair Brigham, is an emergency care physician. And you're right, he was a past guest of this program. So for listeners who are keen to kind of connect up those dots, you can go back through and listen to that episode as well.
That's so worth listening to. He's made so much of things, right? So yeah, definitely go listen to that one. He's got a great story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are rounding the bend into this last segment here, Jonathan. Crystal ball segment, as the name implies, we're looking to future trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And typically, the focus here is on technology. And, technology unto itself, I think, can be viewed as this tool which adds layers of efficiency to different professions. Now, I would assume within your line of work, efficiency equals better outcomes in most cases for patients. But what I learned in actually, again, referencing that conversation I had with Blair, that sometimes technology, what it can offer isn't always the best outcome. It can actually complicate things. And I'd be curious about your perspective on all of this, the role of technology and the way you see it being used or how it plays out sometimes within your line of work.
So as I move up the sort of progressive paramedic thing, so the levels of paramedics, and I get to the critical care part of paramedicine doing the inter-hospital transports, it's far more reliable on technology than any of the other roles, right? Everybody uses technology, but the things that, and I'm sure Blair talked about a lot of these heroic life-sustaining things. So I spent last week doing training on moving patients on ECMO, which is basically a portable heart-lung bypass machine. So if your lungs don't work and your heart doesn't work, up until now, you would have died. So I now have a machine that is probably about the size of a microwave that the patient gets cannulated, and it completely replaces their lungs and their hearts until we figure out the problem, or they can get a lung transplant, or they can correct whatever the underlying thing is. So that technology piece that Blair talks about how it gets a little blurry around the end of life, is huge. And technology in my environment, can't even begin to think of what AI is going to do with our technology. Like, certainly, I think that a lot of the predictive stuff, the clinical aspects, the clinical decision making, I expect in the next few years is going to end up, sort of being defaulted down to AI. But I think if you asked me to predict what my role would be as technology improves, I will take you back to the beginning of the conversation and tell you that my role will become even more important, because as technology increases, as everything becomes more automated, as things like ECMO and heart-lung bypass and end-of-life stuff gets so blurry, you need a human face to help you navigate this. So there will always be me helping you navigate healthcare. So I think certainly we could speculate wildly on where things go with technology, and I am incredibly excited about a lot of the things that are coming forwards within our purview. But I do think when it comes to impact, right, like that, I want to say that Maya Angelou quote where they talk about, not really remembering what you do or say, but always remembering how that person makes you feel. I think about that a lot when I take care of patients. So I think I will anchor onto the humanity part of that as my role, and not fight against the AI, but just make sure that I will always be there to make sure that there's a human face to healthcare. I think that's how I see myself in the future.
Oh, so beautifully put. I mean, I think that puts a nice bow on all of this, and like you said, returning to the beginning of this conversation and that aspect. I think that's something that cannot be overlooked. And yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think moving forward, that human connection is only going to be amplified, as our usage of technology increases, because these are things that people need. We crave that connection with others. And in some of these situations, especially within your line of work, that connection is everything, I'm sure, for a lot of people, for the people you're treating, for family members, of those being treated, so on and so forth. So, yeah. But I can't thank you enough, Jonathan. It's been a true pleasure in learning a little bit more about you and your work. And I know listeners are absolutely going to love all of this. So thanks again for joining the program.
Appreciate you inviting me.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Jonathan and his work, you can do so via LinkedIn. You can also find him on X. He also has his website, KinderMedic.com. And for reference, all of this information, including links, will be in the show notes. And hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share. To show further support, you can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And lastly, as I mentioned at the top, head on over to YouTube. I do have a channel over there which hosts highlights from these audio recordings. And if you do make it over there, I'd love that like or subscribe. And finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a. where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.